In 1831, Madame Lalaurie purchased a three-storey mansion at 1140 Royal Street in the French Quarter. Lalaurie was a socialite and kept slaves, as many women at that time did. Most of the city was shocked at how polite she was to them, showing them kindness in public, and even setting two of them free in 1819. However, soon the rumours began to spread that the politeness in public may have all been an act. The rumours turned out to be true. But before we get into the sordid history of the mansion, I'm going to read out a post used by permission from Reddit user That Asian Latina Girl. A few years ago, I was going through a rough patch financially and was looking for just about any job that would pay decent and had flexible hours. I used to work as a housekeeper and quite honestly was something I was hoping would come up as a job opportunity. At the time I was living in Vacherie, Louisiana, which was kind of far from all the major hustle and bustle that Louisiana has to offer. Lucky for me, a friend of mine told me about a small housekeeping job her boss had mentioned. They were looking for someone to come in 2 times a week to clean the first and second floors of this house that was located downtown in New Orleans. To fast forward things a bit, I ended up going down to the place. Huge beautiful French home literally in the heart of NOLA, and got the job. The first day was vanilla. Nothing but work, you know. I did what I was there to do, and as I got ready to leave, I got a whiff of this horrible stench. Almost like burnt rotten meat. I thought to myself, shit, did I forget to take out the trash? So I ran to the kitchen and the smell faded. After double checking everything, I left. When I came back the day after, I was in the second floor dusting the parlour area when I heard chains being dragged on the floor. At first it startled me and I just brushed it off as somebody outside. But then I heard it again and again. It definitely was coming from inside the house. So I ran as fast as I could downstairs to tell the other housekeeper that somebody else could possibly be inside. It was only the two of us in there that day. She just looked at me and told me to mind my own business and keep working. That it was nothing. She was kind of mean old lady, but I shrugged it off and went back upstairs. Again out of nowhere, that putrid stench of burnt rotten meat filled the air. It was very annoying because just like that, it randomly came and went. Some days you smelt it downstairs, others upstairs. Later on that day, while I was using the restroom, I heard this huge commotion upstairs on the 3rd floor, what sounded like a young girl screaming, "To get in here." I was literally like, what the fuck? I opened the door and heard running upstairs, and then it stops. The yelling, the screaming, everything. I went back downstairs and at this point I was frustrated and told the other housekeeper what I had just heard. She looked at me and she says, "You never heard anything, okay? It's best you just go on as if you don't notice a thing." Thing is, she always assured me that there was no one there, that we were fine. Needless to say, while I worked at the house a whole month, because that's how long I could take, I had heard repetition of the same yelling, screaming and chasing. Other days I'd hear chains dragging and dropping on the floor, but the thing that did it for me was when I was taking my lunch break on the 2nd floor and heard the sudden cry of agony and despair, followed by the sound of chains that seemed to be coming from the 3rd floor. I panicked, thinking someone was hurt and needed help, so as soon as I was getting up to go get help, I saw a tall dark man with chains around his neck, and just like that, I ran out of that house as quickly as possible. I never even told the person that hired me that I had no intention of returning. I just stopped showing up. As rude as that seems, I could care less. I just wanted nothing to do with that place. Anyway, It wasn't until 4 years later, when I had long moved away from Louisiana, that I had returned to New Orleans with a boyfriend on vacation. We decided to do one of their spooky history tours, and I tell you, when I seen that familiar building, my heart sank. Anxiety was building up inside me as the tour guide told the story of the building I once used to work at, and the horrible, tragic, malicious things that happened there. I felt sick to my stomach, that I begged my boyfriend and I to go back to the hotel. When I worked at the infamous Lalaurie mansion, I never knew the history. Heck, I hadn't even heard of it. But after the tour facts and doing my own research, everything I experienced there made sense. It still gives me goosebumps to this day, remembering that day I heard Madame Lalaurie chasing after what could have been a slave girl upstairs on the third floor. I'm almost positive it was her. Also, I will add that the stench of rotten burnt meat could have been the spirits of the many slaves that died tortured by the hands of that evil woman. For almost 2 centuries now, this beautiful, almost 1,200 square foot mansion has stood on Royal Street. It has a rich and terrifying history, and housed probably one of America's first serial killers. Residing at 1140 Royal Street, New Orleans, sits the Lalaurie Mansion. This 1,200 square foot mansion was built in 1831 for Marie Delphine McCartney Lalaurie and her third husband, the French native Dr. Louis Lalaurie. Together, Louis and Delphine were the toast of New Orleans society. Or so everybody thought. The Lalauries were renowned for their extravagant parties. Many considered Mrs. Lalaurie gentle and sweet, and her younger husband a well-known respected doctor. Unbeknownst to the upper class of society in New Orleans, they were anything but gentle and kind. As like most rich white people at the time, the Lalauries maintained several black slaves in the slaves' quarter located on the third floor of the Royal Street Mansion. Famous British social theorist Harriet Martineau, sorry if I butchered that name, archived in her books in 1838, recounting tales told to her by New Orleans residents during her 1836 visit, claimed Lalaurie's slaves were observed to be singularly haggard and wretched. However, in public appearances, Lalaurie was seen to be genuinely polite to black people and solicitous of her slaves' health. Court records of the time showed that Lalaurie manumitted 2 of her slaves, Jean Louis in 1819 and Devenance in 1832. Martineau wrote that public rumours about Lalaurie's mistreatment of her slaves were sufficiently widespread that a local lawyer was dispatched to Royal Street to remind Lalaurie of the laws for the upkeep of the slaves. During the visit, the lawyer found no evidence of wrongdoing or mistreatment of slaves by Lalaurie. Martineau also recounted other tales of Lalaurie's cruelty that were currently amongst New Orleans residents in about 1836. She said that subsequent to the visit of the local lawyer, one of Lalaurie's neighbours saw one of Lalaurie's slaves, a 12-year-old girl named Leah, fall to her death from the roof of the Royal Street Mansion while trying to avoid punishment from a whipped Delphine Lalaurie. Leah had been brushing Delphine's hair when she hit a snag, causing Delphine to grab a whip and chase her. The body was subsequently buried on the mansion grounds. This incident led to an investigation of the Lalauries, in which they were found guilty of illegal cruelty and forced to forfeit 9 slaves. These 9 slaves were brought back to the Lalauries through an intermediate relative and returned to the Royal Street residence. Similarly, Martineau recounted stories that Lalaurie kept her cook chained to the kitchen stove and beat her when they attempted to feed the slaves. In 1834, a fire broke out of the mansion, and this would completely change the public's opinion of the Lalaurie family residence. This next clip is from one of the ghost tours explaining exactly what happened that night.
Had on one in an extreme way on one particular evening in the month of April of 1834, when one of the revelers, standing right about where we are on this opposite side of the street, notices that billowing out of a second-story window near that courtyard that you see is a very thick plume of black smoke. Well, where there is smoke, there must be fire, so they immediately ran down to the nearby fire station. Firefighters would arrive here a short time later. Buckets in hand, they made their way up to that second-story room where it appeared that the blaze had started. As they get up to that second room, they are startled to find that an elderly enslaved woman is found crouched on the floor, with her ankles shackled and chained to the legs of the cast-iron stove that had caught fire to the drapes behind it. Immediately, they took their buckets, dousing the blaze, extinguishing it only moments before what would have undoubtedly become an agonizing demise. So she was very incoherent. She could barely speak, but did manage to say the following words. Go upstairs, look upstairs, and you'll find the answer there. Now, what could that mean? So Lewis and Delphine, they're standing closely thereby, and they're saying, listen, you don't want to listen to this old woman. She is senile. She doesn't know what she's talking about. The reason we had her chained up was because she tried to run away on us before. So thank you for saving our home. Now let's all just sort of go about our business, shall we? Fair enough, said the firefighters, so they began to walk away. But as they began to walk away, they began to think to themselves, I wonder what that old woman was really talking about. I wonder what really is going on upstairs on the third floor of that house. So secretly, quietly, with their ladders, they made their way back into the house without anyone noticing. They would arrive at that second-story gallery that you see, and they would rest the top of the ladder against that cornice that separates the second from the third floors. Just below that second window from the left, up at the very top on the third story, the one that has since been plastered over. You have to take my word for it when I say that at the time, it was a regular glass window just like all the rest of them. So they began to scale the ladder as they get up to the top. They lift open the window, and immediately the most noxious stench they'd ever encountered hit their senses. And as they pull back the drapes and step into the room, what they discover inside was described in the morning newspaper as the single most horrific sight of carnage ever witnessed by human eyes. Every interior wall of the third level of this house is lined with the bodies, some living, some deceased, of enslaved individuals, each one of whom had some kind of horrible, primeval, experimental surgery performed. We're talking about primitive lobotomies, gashes cut into the flesh, limbs amputated. One young woman was reduced to a head and a torso as her arms and legs had been severed from her body without a bit of anesthesia, so that she was left to flail about enclosed in an iron cage. These firefighters immediately became sick to their stomachs. They'd never seen anything so grotesque, but they knew they had a job to do. We have got to save whomever we can save. So they would run down to a nearby hospital, and help would arrive here a short time later. Now, in the meantime, a crowd had gathered here out onto the intersection. Lewis and Delphine, they're trying to basically shush the crowd. Listen, there's nothing to see here. The fire has been put out. So sure enough, people began to calm themselves until the gates to the courtyard swing open, and from them emerge on stretchers the first of the tortured slaves, the second of the tortured slaves, the third and the fourth, and so on. This horrible, grisly deed was finally being brought to light in a most extreme way. You have to understand that even prior to the abolition of slavery, this would have been considered an absolute atrocity. People were furious. They wanted to kill Lewis and Delphine. How dare they do such a thing? But this couple was far too clever to be undone. Immediately they rushed back inside of the house, locking themselves inside. Only minutes later, the doors to the carriage house swing open, and from them emerge, in a horse-drawn carriage, Louis and Delphine and their essential belongings. Bound they were for the Mississippi River. Of course, people tried to chase after them, but all to no avail. To this day, it doesn't appear that this couple would ever again return to New Orleans.
You see, some of the eyewitnesses claim that there were at least 7 slaves, beaten, bruised, and bloody to within an inch of their lives. Some of them had their eyes gouged out, skin flayed, and mouths filled with excrement, and then sewn shut. One particularly disturbing report claimed there was a woman whose bones had been broken and reset so that she resembled a crab, and that another woman was wrapped in human intestines. The witnesses also claimed that there were people with holes in their skulls and wooden spoons near them that would be used to stir their brains. There were other rumours that there were dead bodies in the attic as well, their corpses mutilated beyond recognition, their organs not all intact or inside their bodies. Some say there were only a handful of bodies. Others claimed that there were over 100 victims. Either way, it cemented Madame Lalaurie's reputation as one of the most brutal women in history.
The fire marshal lights 2 lanterns, hands the first one to the police chief, who takes out a pistol, walks in, goes to the right. The fire marshal with his own lantern and a club walks in and goes to the left. Though he enters second, he cries out first because he bumps into something. One of 2 operating tables, upon which a man and a woman have been chained, and they are still alive. Brings the lantern closer and finds that he's mistaken. Well, yes, they are still alive. No, they're no longer a man and a woman. They are the victims of a crude sex change operation.
Several slaves were found in various stages of torture. I understand one gentleman had his mouth sewn shut. When they cut through the stitching, found his mouth stuffed with feces.
Then the police chief has his moment. He goes over to the right where he finds a male slave, arms chained above his head. His face has been sliced down the middle and across the center from ear to ear underneath his nose. Each quadrant of his face has been meticulously peeled back and pinned to a corresponding portion of his skull. And it appears that there are violent muscle contractions going on underneath where his face used to be. When they bring that lantern closer, they find that those are not muscles contracting. Those are maggots feeding. Maggots intentionally introduced by Dr. Louis in a sadistic experiment to see how long human life can be sustained with the vermin eating the infection that grows there. Now, imagine being one of those people standing out on the street on Governor Nichols, sipping your wine, listening to the band, having really what's just an outrageous party. Then the human atrocities, one after another, come down from the uppermost room, paraded past them down a few blocks to go to the hospital, where every single one of them was euthanized, put out of their misery. Because I'm only just talking about here the ones who are still alive. There were dozens of people who had not survived these outright tortures and sadistic experiments. And when the crowd assembled on the other side of the street saw their remains, they were whipped into an angry mob. They wanted to go inside and lynch the Lalauries. But the problem is, $4.3 million will buy you an awful lot of police officers. 98 of them accepted hefty bribes. With axes, rifles, and clubs, they formed barricades at either end of the street, and they held back the swelling mob all night long. At 10:30 in the morning on April 11th, the doors of the main mansion open wide, and out comes a carriage led by 6 black horses driven by Bastien, the loyal slave, who has a pistol in one hand and a bullwhip in the other. He parks the carriage right there. Out comes Dr. Louis with a rifle, looking menacing at the crowd. Madame Delphine, very calmly and casually, walks out of the door, looks at both ends of the crowd, and then, according to legend, has the audacity to wave before stepping inside and closing the door. And they make their way safely all the way by way of Bayou St. John to Les Pontchartrain, where a schooner's already waiting for them, carries them across to Mandeville. They liquidate their assets and take all of that gold and cash up to New York City, where they spend 9 days going jewelry shopping, dress shopping, and attending the opera. We know this. We still have their receipts. And then they book passage to Paris and disappear. Most scholars agree that the likely outcome of their story is that they arrived safely in Paris under assumed names. With all of that money, no one asked any questions. They lived happily ever after, having never been brought to justice for their crimes. We, on the other hand, were left with a blight of our city's history.
This is a woman who came from money, married into money. She obviously saw the slaves as well beneath her, but you have to understand, this poor girl witnessed her father getting decapitated by a slave during a slave ride in Santo Domingo. This scarred her mentally from a very young age, and she never got over it. Hence, I believe she was taking advantage of her wealth and her previous husband's wealth and buying these people and venting her frustration on them in such a horrendous manner. I always chalk it up to the worst case scenario of xenophobia that I've ever heard of. Fear of other cultures. Pure and simple. Fear and ignorance.
So, with the sordid history of the mansion, you can just imagine all the ghost stories that have come out about this place.
What we do know is that this building would stand vacant for some nearly 40 years after that. It would not be until the 1840s, the 1870s really, that a very wealthy landowner would purchase this building and divide it up as rentals. But strangely, as some tenants were moving in, others were moving out, each claiming to have encountered some rather disturbing paranormal occurrences. They would say that you would hear what sounded like these echoing voices resonating throughout the house. So you could hear what sounded like chains rattling from within the walls. Time and again, people would try to develop this property, and time and again, tenants would run screaming from it. One particular property owner, having read of what happened on that fateful night in 1834, decided to have that second window from the left up on the third story plastered over so that theoretically no one would ever have to look upon those same horrific sights as encountered by those firefighters on that dreadful evening. It was more symbolic than anything else. So, as of about 4 months ago, there were people living here in peace, seemingly. These were rental properties. Some claim that the building has simply been refurbished and remodeled so many times that the ghosts, the territorial beings that they are, no longer recognize this property as familiar territory. Others claim that in the 1970s, at the height of the parapsychology movement, that this building was visited by a group of mediums who sought to exorcise the building. That is to say, chase away evil spirits. I happen to have been talking to a friend of mine who happened to know as a computer technician. He was telling me one night he was visiting a friend who was living here at the time, and he's working on his friend's computer when he happens to hear this loud slamming sound coming from behind him. He turns and he notices on the opposite wall that there's this painting that is literally lifting itself off the wall and slamming itself back onto the wall. He nearly jumps out of his skin and politely informs his friend, if you ever have any more trouble with your computer, please call someone else. I'm not going back in there. Now, one property owner, having read of what happened on that fateful night in 1834, decided to have that second window from the left up at the very top plastered over as a kind of symbolic gesture so that theoretically no one would ever have to look upon those same horrid sights as encountered by those firefighters on that dreadful evening. It was more symbolic than anything else. Today, this house is once again a single residence. Earlier this year, it was purchased. It is today one of 2 houses in the city, one of several in the United States, currently owned by a certain actor, Nicolas Cage.
It is instantly known as the haunted house. April 12th, people walking by on that same side of the street heard screams, unearthly groans from inside. And they were so convinced that whatever may be generating it must be demonic in nature, they called the likeliest person, the Roman Catholic priest. They said, you've got to go inside and exorcise this building. The priest's response was, hell no. So he then hires 6 Protestant American soldiers, and they go in with him on April 16th. They go inside, and they're in for about 15 minutes. Because they heard, quote, otherworldly languages of the dead being spoken by angry spirits, unquote.
There's a period in the 1880s where the home was occupied by a variety of families. There is a woman who does make a report to a local paper. She claims she is heading towards her children's rooms, I believe, found a woman holding what she believed was her own child, I understand, and then hurls this infant down the stairs. And it turns out it wasn't hers. It was evidently the spirit of someone else's child. We don't know who. I don't know who. And there was a very similar incident shortly after that. She also made this report about going into the room, found a woman hovering over the crib, rushes towards the crib to protect her child. The woman disappears right before her and then realizes her baby has a sock stuffed in her mouth. She quickly removes it. Baby was fine. But I shudder to think that Delphine Lalaurie could actually affect the physical plane and actually suffocate somebody. That is just too terrible to imagine.
1953, City Council apparently even considered buying the building. But then another developer came in and said, well, we're going to do it and we're going to convert it into apartments and get people from out of town to live in them. Brilliant! And so that's precisely what they did. But of course, renovations require, among other things, putting down new floorboards. So they go in the summer of 1953, and they're about ready to put down modern plumbing. But first they rip up the old floorboards, and they find underneath a lot more than old plumbing. They find 8 human skeletons, full signs of great distress underneath the floorboards, especially when you consider the horror that the underside of the floorboards had scratch marks. 8 people had been buried alive inside that mansion. And now we know more about the legends that started about this place being haunted back in the 1830s. People hearing screams from the other side of the street. Those weren't ghosts. Those were real people underneath the floorboards begging for help. And they did not speak French or Spanish or English, but rather an obscure dialect of Senegambian. These were illegally smuggled West African slaves. They were crying out for help in the only way they knew how, which was of course then misinterpreted as otherworldly languages of the dead being spoken by angry spirits. On a different level, I have already mentioned that I'm a tour guide, and one thing that happened to me personally is that over the course of my 2.5 years being a haunted history tour guide, I have had no less than 23 people on my tours faint.
When it happens, I try to make certain it's either from dehydration, too much drinking, medical condition, before I chalk it up to direct paranormal effect from the home itself.
Andrew was our guide. He's magnificent, by the way. And I was standing taking pictures as he told of the torture and the mayhem that went on inside the house. Before we left, my daughter came to my side and told me that she was about to faint. I thought she was just feeling the heat, but soon after she went down and out. This is the first and only time she has ever fainted. She rested, and a second later she was fine. Needless to say, this ended the tour for us. And so I'm somewhat less of a skeptic now. Thanks for the great tour.
As far as visual evidence, photographic evidence from the Lalaurie mansion, countless orbs have appeared in photographs. I don't jump the gun and dub every single orb as proof. There's always the possibility of dust through just the foot traffic or the motor traffic. The humidity down here, definitely, but that will give you some illusions of activity in photographs as well. But as far as people seeing things, yes, there have been a few accounts where people have actually seen what looks like smoke entering or exiting the home. There was a period where, shortly after I joined the company, my girlfriend would walk along with me on the tour. And sometimes she gets ahead of me. She knows my route. She would often get to the Lalaurie mansion before me. And on a few different occasions, she would report seeing the tail of a gown going through one of the doors right there from the street. Doors we know are not actually being used. They're bolted shut. They're primarily windows these days. I have seen what I suspect was Delphine looking out of the window. At one point she was on a rear balcony. But yeah, there have been countless sightings that I can recall.
Between 1953 and 2006, it was apartments. People from all over the country and around the world will come in and stay inside, and the average length of stay was about 1 year. We can still speak to a lot of them to this day.
My name is Annie Sobel. I lived in the Lalaurie house back in the mid-60s. I lived there with my father and my younger brother, Stephen. One evening, my father was walking us home from an evening out. We just come from dinner, and we were across the street on Royal, diagonally across the street. And I glanced up at the top of the building, and I saw what I could have sworn to be a child sitting on top of the roof. Looked like a little girl. She was wearing something white, and her legs were dangling over the side of the roof. And I gasped. I was a little frightened. By the time I turned to my father and I said, Dad, look up. And by the time he looked up, there was nothing there. But I saw that little girl sitting on the rooftop.
The story of the little girl, I used to see her in the courtyard. I said, "Who are you? What happened to you? Please tell me where you are, what's going on. Did she actually beat you?" and stuff like that. And she never answered me. She disappeared. I'm sure she was a slave, and but couldn't see her face. She had her hair, actually, a lot of hair on her face, and she was always with the head down, sitting like that. But what can I tell you? It was frightening.
And till this day, I will neither ride by there or walk by there once it's dark, because I'm so afraid that I might see that little girl.
So whether you believe in ghosts or not, you have to admit the history of that place is just so fascinating. It's definitely some place I'm going to have to visit at one point. Anyway, if you like my videos, please like and subscribe and consider joining Patreon. I'm just well warning you for the next video because it's going to be quite graphic. I've already started it and I'm doing a lot of research and it's going down a lot of rabbit holes, but it will show some graphic pictures. And you're going to need your tinfoil hat for this one, so be well warned. Until the next one, see you later, guys.